was KCSD. His true identity is Troy Allen White, a 10-year Kent County Sheriff's deputy, but sadly, a suspect in this situation.
I got some stuff to figure out, like what you put down. So,
What I put down?
yeah, you work for the Sheriff's Department? Okay, what do you do there?
4119
Why'd you lie to me?
Yeah, from 4119 15.
My wife pointed out I was not at work when I said I was.
4528 4120 status check.
Obviously, at this point, I got to confirm that you work for the Sheriff's Department, which then would generally let you have the gun, but not having any ID seems like a mistake on your part. Is that in your car?
I can give my envelope number.
So here's where we're at this point. We're going to work on confirming whether you are actually work for the Sheriff's Department. After we confirm that,
It was a neighbor, but we don't know who. They never answered on call back.
because you don't have a CPL listed, or it's actually I'll have to run it a little different.
Should be covered on wheels, I guess.
Yes, it would be. But generally with LEOSA, you have to carry your ID with you too.
Sure.
But that's a different story. The false name is obviously an issue, and the original accusation is obviously an issue. But
Well, like I said, the name is, I'm not supposed to be at work, so that's why I was concerned about that.
I got my chief kind of working on that side of it. He wasn't quite at home yet, so now are you living with your wife or separated or something?
Nope, we're all living together.
Okay. And why is it you just didn't want to be home today?
Just finally a day off. On my days off, I got the kids all day, so. Again, she thought I was at training, which originally did have training planned, but they canceled it last minute, so the babysitter was already coming out. So it was one of those, either I say, hey, training got canceled, babysitter stays home.
You're out to work, you can bring that Central Station.
I'm at training.
Your shot.
I'm not. If that makes sense.
Nope, I understand. All right, here's the deal. So we're going to run you to the Sheriff's Department. Going to PMP you there, take you to Ottawa County, lodge on false info, indecent exposure, $100 bond for each.
Okay.
So you'll be able to post bond tonight. I'm going to tell you you're going to get suspended when we get down to the Sheriff's Department here. We're going to meet with Lieutenant Van Single. She has questions in regards to your vehicle and whether your attack stuff is in your vehicle.
Okay.
And I'm sure it's around somewhere. Is that something we can secure? So it's not sitting in the car, in the truck. Obviously, they're going to want that back as duty weapons if you're going to be suspended.
Yeah, no, they can get it out of there.
Okay. How do you want to do that? You want to tell me where the car is? I can get one of my guys' keys, or
I'm trying to think if it's locked up in there or not. So the rifle will be under the back seat, and there's my duty pistol in the center console that might be locked.
okay. And there's a key on
Yes, the driver's key should unlock it.
driver's key would unlock that. Okay. And your wallet's in there. Do you have your ID and your badge in there as well?
That should be it with the pistol. Yep.
Okay. All right.
Troy gave consent to search his truck, and what the officers found was beyond shocking.
1526.
Inside the vehicle, officers found 3 additional Sheriff's Department firearms, ammunition, and his badge. And behind the driver's seat, a flesh-colored dildo. The discovery raised questions investigators couldn't answer on scene about intent, behavior, and whether this incident was isolated. During a follow-up call, officers asked the victim a necessary question, whether she could have mistaken what she saw.
I just have a few other questions. This question might seem a little strange, but what you saw, you described it as his penis.
Right.
Do you know what color it looked like?
So I was thinking about this a lot last night because one of the officers asked me, "Are you sure it was his penis?" And I was like, yeah.
Okay.
And then I started to think, well, I suppose it could have been a strap-on dildo that he was wearing through his pants.
Mm-hmm.
But it was certainly an erect penis that was very, and this is why I noticed, because it was a very white compared to his pants.
Got it.
Like, that's what caught my eye.
Got it. It was very white compared to his pants. There was a definite contrast.
Right.
Okay. So you're saying it's white or light in color. Okay. All right. That's helpful. And
Because that is what caught my eye, was that color contrast.
Yeah.
Where a color contrast should not be.
Yep. And to you,
And I could see top of pants and then that.
Okay. And
So it was like out of the fly.
it was out of the fly. Yep. That's what you mentioned. I think to Sergeant Colser at the time when you talked to him. And did it appear real?
I can't say that I was super interested in
Right. I know you didn't want to glance. You didn't
visual
want
analysis.
Yes.
More in disbelief, like, oh my gosh, is this really happening? This can't be really happening. No, I think this is really happening.
Right.
And as I'm running by, and so seeing it in profile, very straight.
Okay.
So for whatever that's worth.
Okay. Okay. But is it fair? I mean, just from talking to you yesterday, you made it clear that it was completely erect, and it's fair that it appeared to be real to you.
Oh yeah, and
Yeah.
the thing that I was thinking last night is that okay, even if it is a dildo,
Mhm.
that's still not cool
Of course not.
to be walking around town with that sticking out of your pants.
Right.
Like that's conveying the same essence.
Apparently, the victim knew exactly what she saw, and the suspect wouldn't go without facing consequences. Troy was charged with indecent exposure and providing false information to police. He posted bond and was released. 1 week later, he resigned from the Kent County Sheriff's Office before the internal investigation concluded. The case remained pending, but the question lingered. What was a dildo doing in an officer's vehicle, and how many people had crossed paths with a deputy who knew the law well enough to break it and almost walk away? Let's know what you think in the comments.
the open fifths voicings in this song.
Yeah.
This is another thing that you just didn't hear people do in songs. It was such a unique hook.
Yeah.
And this song is just hook after hook after hook.
Yeah. Well, it's a great construction. I mean, it is my favorite song. I played it only a few hours ago in Florida. I play it instrumentally, but I use that backing track. But yeah, I mean, it's outlining the songs with that way of playing, like instead of C sharp minor with all the notes, you leave out the third. So you've got C sharp, G sharp, and D sharp. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah, and then A. Yeah, so you do it. That's the same approach on all the chords, which is basically C sharp minor, A, F sharp minor, B. Yeah. I only played this 5 minutes. No, C sharp minor, A, B, F sharp minor. That's what.
B, F sharp minor.
Oh, need a guitar in my hand. Yeah, so this became a very definitive approach for me in terms of playing the verses, the chorus underneath the vocal to reduce it to this. And I like to think that I was pretty musically educated by the time I was in the police. I played a lot of. This might seem unusual, but a lot of Bartok violin duets, learning both parts and listening to that, the 44 Bartok violins, which was, very hip to me musically and just wonderful musical writing. But, one of the albums, I don't know if it was on this one, no, I think it was when we were in Montserrat, I was relearning all those, I can't learn all of them, but playing those Bartok violin duets. I wanted to do them with Robert Fripp, but I don't think he was quite up for it. But maybe somebody should make an album, a guitar duet album of those. Maybe I'll do it. Actually, that's a good idea. Project, yeah.
I'd like to take a second to talk to you about this channel. This is actually Rick Beato 2. I've had it since the beginning of my main channel, and many of you are not subscribed. As a matter of fact, 87% of the people that watch this channel regularly are not subscribed. So I encourage you to hit the subscribe button on this channel and on my
There is this building, and I'll put it up here, that's 265 feet wide, built of stone and concrete, and surrounded by an 8-foot barbed wire fence. The signs mark it as belonging to the South Korea's Aviation Authority, and it has navigational equipment mounted on top. Other models of this antenna platform can be seen elsewhere in South Korea, and the equipment for them does not extend below the platform, meaning the equipment is only built atop the building in question. The purpose of the building itself is unexplained. Now, the building itself looks to be like 50 to 70 years old. Very, very interesting that this is a big, round building atop a mountain, which you could potentially, build into. I don't know. Is that what we're talking about here? We're talking about a 300-foot craft? That would be cool. That would be a cool connection. We carry on with the description of the UFOB. The dome may or may not include windows or ports, and ports are present around the lower rim of the disc in some instances. Most disc-shaped craft are equipped with lights on the top and bottom, and also around the rim. These lights are not visible when the craft is at rest or not functioning. There are generally no visible antenna or projections. Landing gear consists of 3 extendable legs, ending in circular landing pads. When fully extended, this landing gear supports the main body 2 to 3 feet above the surface at the lowest point. A rectangular hatch is located along the equator or on the lower surface of the disc. So we're talking about standard flying saucer sci-fi type discs here. Interesting that they said there's no protrusions or antennas. The UFO that Bob worked on, I think, was specifically said to have, I think, a 3 or 4 foot antenna above it. B, fuselage or cigar shaped. We hear about these a lot from pilots, by the way, these specific ones. Documented reports of this type of craft are extremely rare. Air Force radar reports indicate they're approximately 2,000 feet long and 95 feet thick. What? 2,000 feet? That's massive. My God. Let's calculate this in American metrics. How many fridges wide is 2,000 feet?
If we assume a standard fridge is about 3 feet wide, then 2,000 feet would be roughly 677 fridges lined up side by side.
677 fridges long, folks. That is incredible. That is incredible. And apparently they do not operate in the lower atmosphere. Okay. Very little information is available on the performance of these craft, but radar reports have indicated speeds in excess of 7,000 miles an hour. They do not appear to engage in the violent and erratic maneuvers associated with the smaller types. Violent? What? I assume they're only being violent because we're attacking them first. I don't know. C, ovoid or circular shape. Orbs, if you will. This type of craft is described as being shaped like an ice cream cone, being rounded at the large end and tapered to a near point on the other end. Okay, wait, so this is like a teardrop shape. This is what actually John Ramirez on the latest podcast kind of described too. Very interesting. Egg-shaped, if you will. They're approximately 30 to 40 feet long, and the thick end diameter is approximately 20% of the length. There is an extremely bright light at the pointed end, and this craft usually travels point down. They can appear to be any shape from round to cylindrical, depending upon the angle of observation. Often sightings of this type of craft are elliptical craft, seen at an inclined angle or edge on. So that is interesting too, that the angle of which you're looking at this egg-shaped craft might change your, analysis of what that craft might be. And that, I think, is fair to say. From Commander Fravor to Chris Bledsoe to all these other cases, we hear about either a tic-tac, oval, cigar, round. Maybe that's just the angle at which we're seeing it, especially if there are no seams. Looking at it from a certain angle and plus the bright light might give off that effect. Very interesting. And finally, D, airfoil or triangular shaped. Whoa, this is 1954, folks. We're not talking, I don't think we're talking about TR-3A or TR-3B, but maybe. 1954 is an interesting time to be talking about triangular shaped craft. This craft is believed to be new technology due to the rarity and recency of observations. Radar indicates an isosceles triangle profile, the longest side being nearly 300 feet in length. Little is known about the performance of these craft due to the rarity of good sightings. They are believed to be capable of high speeds and abrupt maneuvers similar to or exceeding the performance attributed to the types of A and C. Whoa. Interesting that they say this is a new type of craft. So new to them, inserting it into here to, help the propagation of some type of blue beam project. Who knows? 10. Description of extraterrestrial biological entities. Here we go, folks. We're talking about aliens. Examinations of remains recovered from wreckage of UFOBs indicate that EBEs may be classified into two distinct categories as follows. EBE Type 1. These entities are humanoid and might be mistaken for human beings of the Oriental race if seen from a distance. They are bipedal, 5 to 5 foot 4 inches in height, and weigh 80 to 100 pounds. They're just little fellas. They're just little fellas, really. Proportionally, they are similar to humans, although the cranium is somewhat larger and more rounded. The skin is a pale, chalky yellow in color, thick and slightly pebbled in appearance. Slightly pebbled. The eyes are small, wide-set, almond-shaped, with brownish-black irises, with very large pupils. The whites of the eyes are not like that of humans, but have a pale gray cast. The ears are small and set low on the skull. The nose is thin and long, and the mouth is wider than in humans and nearly lipless. There is no apparent facial hair and very little body hair, that being very fine and confined to the underarm and groin area. The body is thin and without apparent body fat, but the muscles are well developed. Oh, they're slightly jacked. The hands are small with 4 long digits, but no opposable thumb. The outside digit is jointed in a manner as to be nearly opposable, and there is no webbing between the fingers as in humans. The legs are slightly, but noticeably bowed, and the feet are somewhat splayed and proportionally large. That is one of the strangest descriptions. EBE Type 2. And by the way, Type 1 seems to be the EBEs that were discovered at Aztec. If you look at William Steinman's book, UFO Crash at Aztec, it talks about 16 bodies, I believe, that were found within this 100-foot craft. The craft was intact. The bodies were referred to as small children, which is also what Bob Lazar referred to them as at S4. They called them the kids because they didn't look like the typical Greys. They looked like small humanoid, but have like larger heads and were smaller, but had like tiny facial features, like human-like. And in Aztec, it was even said that they had perfect teeth. EBE Type 2. These entities are humanoid, but differ from Type 1 in many respects. They are bipedal, 3 feet 5 inches to 4 foot 2 inches in height, and weigh about 25 to 50 pounds. Oh, you can just throw them. Proportionally, the head is much larger than humans, or Type 1 EBEs, the cranium being much larger and elongated. The eyes are very large, slanted, and nearly wrap around the side of the skull. They are black with no whites showing. There is no noticeable brow ridge, and the skull has a slight peak that runs over the crown. The nose consists of 2 small slits, which sit high above the mouth, the slit-like mouth. There are no external ears. The skin is a pale bluish-gray color, being somewhat darker on the back of the creature, and is very smooth and fine-celled. There is no hair on either the face or the body, and these creatures do not appear to be mammalian. The arms are long in proportion to the legs, and the hands have 3 long, tapering fingers, and a thumb which is nearly as long as the fingers. The second finger is thicker than the others, but not as long as the index finger. The feet are small and narrow, and the 4 toes are jointed together with a membrane. It is not definitely known where either type of creature originated, but it seems certain that they did not evolve on Earth. It is further evident, although not certain, that they may have originated on 2 different planets. So it seems like Type 1 definitely is more of a humanoid type alien that couldn't necessarily pass for a real human, but maybe a closer cousin to Homo sapiens. And Type 2 seems to be your typical sort of skinny bob. 50 pounds. Also tridactyl. I thought 4 fingers. No, they say 3. Very interesting. Tridactyl gray beings. Are these the same beings that are present in Peru? Time will tell. All right, moving on. The description of the ET technology. This is super interesting. Now we're talking about, what are we talking about here? Probes, wands? The following information is from preliminary analysis reports of wreckage collected from crash sites of extraterrestrial craft, 1947 to 1953. Pause. 1953, we're talking about the Kingman, Arizona crash. That might be the reference here. Excerpts from which are quoted verbatim to provide guidance as to the type of characteristics of material that might be encountered in future recovery operations. A, initial analysis of the debris from the crash site seems to indicate that the debris is that of extraterrestrial craft, which exploded from within and came into contact with the ground with great force, completely destroying the craft. The volume of the matter indicates that the craft was approximately the size of a medium aircraft, although the weight of the debris indicates that the craft was extremely light for its size. B, metallurgical analysis of the bulk of the debris recovered indicates that the samples are not composed of any material currently known to terrestrial science. C, the material tested possesses great strength and resistance to heat in proportion to its weight and size, being stronger by far than any materials used in military or civilian aircraft at present. That's an interesting point because the 4chan whistleblower also said that these things were extremely heat resistant, which made it nearly impossible to work with. D, much of the material having the appearance of aluminum foil or aluminum magnesium sheeting displays none of the characteristics of either metal, resembling instead some kind of unknown plastic-like material. E, solid structures and substantial beams having a distinct similarity in appearance to very dense grain-free wood, was very light in weight and possesses tensile and compression strength not obtainable by any means known to modern industry. Whoa. F, none of the material tested displayed measurable magnetic characteristics or residual radiation. No radiation, not magnetic. G, several samples were engraved or embossed with marks and patterns. These patterns were not readily identifiable, and attempts to decipher their meaning has been largely unsuccessful. H, examination of several apparent mechanical devices, gears, etc., revealed little or nothing of their function or methods of manufacture. This is really interesting stuff. The grain-free wood is a really interesting way to describe something. You know, if you were to think grain-free wood or some type of plastic, even Bob Lazar said that the craft that he worked on, he wasn't convinced was metallic. It felt cold to the touch, but that doesn't mean it was metal. You know, maybe some type of stone or lightweight granite or something. All these descriptions of these materials seem a little foreign, and we hear about the material that you bend and it goes back to what it originally was. You know, back then we also didn't have carbon fiber. You know, we didn't have any of this advanced sort of metallic alloys that we have today. So maybe today, with a keener eye and more sufficiently advanced tech, we'd be able to properly, determine what this stuff is, or at least the contractors, Raytheon and Lockheed and all the above, probably already know this. Next up, we got the press blackout, number 12. This is chapter 3 in recovery operations. So what they go through when they recover one of these crashed UFOBs. Great care must be taken to preserve the security of any location where extraterrestrial technology might be retrievable for scientific study. Extreme measures must be taken to protect and preserve any material or craft from discovery, examination, or removal by civilian agencies or individuals of the general public. It is therefore recommended that a total press blackout be initiated whenever possible. If this course of action should not prove feasible, the following cover stories are suggested for release or to the press. The officer in charge will act quickly to select the cover story that best fits the situation. It should be remembered when selecting a cover story that official policy regarding UFOBs is that they do not exist. A, official denial. Whoa, this is really interesting. I'm having a flashback to a discussion I had with Lou Elizondo on the podcast when we had Lou back in January. Lou said something really interesting there. He said,
"There's a saying we have, first of all, you deny everything, you admit nothing, and then you make counter-accusations."
Well, interesting. A, official denial. The most desirable response would be that nothing unusual has occurred. By stating that the government has no knowledge of the event, further investigation by the public press may be forestalled. B, discredit witnesses. If at all possible, witnesses will be held incommunicado until the extent of their knowledge and involvement can be determined. Witnesses will be discouraged from talking about what they have seen, and intimidation may be necessary to ensure their cooperation. If witnesses have already contacted the press, it will be necessary to discredit their stories. This can best be done by the assertion that they have either misinterpreted natural events, are the victims of hysteria or hallucinations, or are the perpetrators of hoaxes. All of the above we've heard of, by the way. Especially the hoax part when you look into things like not only the Gulf Breeze situation in Florida, but Aztec. Probably the most monumental and well-covered crash retrieval incident in the history of the United States was dismissed as a hoax immediately before the press got a hold of it by the FBI. And when looking into it, you realize there's a lot more to it. I'm leaving you guys breadcrumbs, by the way. C, deceptive statements. It may become necessary to issue false statements to preserve the security of the site. Meteors, downed satellites, weather balloons, and military aircraft are all acceptable alternatives, although, in the case of the downed military aircraft statement, care should be exercised not to suggest the aircraft might be experimental or secret, as this might arouse more curiosity of both the American and foreign press. Statements issued concerning contamination of the area due to toxic spills from trucks or railroad tankers can also serve to keep unauthorized or undesirable personnel away from the area. Sneaky. Super sneaky. 13, secure the area. The area must be secured as rapidly as possible to keep authorized personnel from infiltrating the site. The officer in charge will set up a perimeter and establish a command post inside the perimeter. Personnel allowed on the site will be kept to the absolute minimum necessary to prepare the craft or debris for transport and will consist of military security forces. Local authorities may be pressed into service on traffic and crowd control. Under no circumstances will local official or law enforcement personnel be allowed inside the perimeter, and all necessary precautions should be taken to ensure that they do not interfere with the operation. Now that's interesting because also, I go back to the Aztec crash because it's something that I'm looking into right now, but local law enforcement apparently was at the site. This is 1948, 8 months after Roswell. Things were still a little dicey on the recovery side, I'm guessing. And so, they doubled down on their security tactics, apparently. So A perimeter. It is desirable that sufficient military personnel be utilized to set up a perimeter around the site large enough to keep both unauthorized personnel and the perimeter personnel from seeing the site. We've had incidences in 1947, according to Philip Corso. Apparently, the perimeters weren't well established, and people were just kind of onlookers were kind of seeing this thing happen in real time. Once the site is contained, regular patrols will be set up along the perimeter to ensure complete security, and electronic surveillance will be utilized to augment the patrols. Perimeter personnel will be equipped with hand communication and automatic weapons with live ammunition. Personnel working at the site will carry sidearms. No unauthorized personnel will be allowed into the secure area. B, command post. Ideally, the command post should be as close to the site as is practical to efficiently coordinate operations. As soon as the command post is operational, contact with the Majestic 12 group will be established via secure communications. C, area sweep. The site and surrounding area will be cleared of all unauthorized personnel. Witnesses will be debriefed and detained for further evaluation by MJ-12. Under no circumstances will witnesses be released from custody until their stories have been evaluated by MJ-12 and they have been thoroughly debriefed. D, situation evaluation. A preliminary evaluation of the situation will be completed and a preliminary report prepared. The MJ-12 group will then be briefed on the situation at the earliest possible opportunity. The MJ-12 group will then make a determination as to whether or not a MJ-12 red team or OPNAC team will be dispatched to the area. What is an OPNAC team?
An OPNAC team refers to a group within the Office of the Chief of Naval Operations, OPNAV, that focuses on specific naval operations core functions. The N denotes a particular area of responsibility, such as operations, intelligence, or logistics. The C signifies a specific command or division within that area. These teams are integral to the Navy's organizational structure, ensuring effective management and coordination of various naval operations.
Well, it looks like ChatGPT steered me wrong a little bit here. OPNAC is actually rumored to possibly be an acronym said to stand for Operations National Advisory Committee, or variations like Operational National Command. It's not an officially recognized organization, and so in UFO lore, it's sometimes described as like a high-level military or intelligence unit involved in crash retrievals, extraterrestrial contact, or special access programs, or SAPs. So if I make reference mistakenly to naval intelligence, well, forgive me. But that doesn't mean the Navy isn't involved. Once again, folks, the Navy inserts itself into the crash retrieval narrative quite deeply. As mentioned again by John Ramirez, former CIA officer, he says the highest, most top secret program, which he was refused to be read into, had to do with underwater recovery. Let's go into Section 2, the technology recovery, removal and transport. And this includes entities as well. As soon as the communication is established, removal and transport of all material will commence under order from MJ-12. A, documentation. If the situation permits, care should be taken to document the area with photographs before anything is moved. The area will be checked for radiation and other toxic agents. If the area cannot be kept secure for an extended period of time, all material must be packed and transported as quickly as possible to the nearest secure military facility. This will be accomplished by covered transport using little traveled roads wherever possible. B, complete or functional craft. Craft are to be approached with extreme caution if they appear functional, as serious injury may result from exposure to radiation and electrical discharges. If the craft is functioning, but appears to be abandoned, involve Red Team personnel wearing protective clothing. Any device that seems to be functioning should also be left to MJ-12 Red Team disposal. Complete craft and parts of craft too large to be transported by covered transport will be disassembled, if this can be accomplished easily and quickly. If they must be transported whole, or on open flatbed trailers, they will be covered in such a manner as to camouflage their shape. Whoa. So they're actively camouflaging their shape during transport. That's interesting. Because obviously seeing a saucer on a flatbed, kind of gives it away. Wow. Maybe now is a good time to remind you that our Majestic 12 MJ-12 merch line is now available. Collection comes complete with hats, patches, pins, sweaters, t-shirts, journals, pencils, so many different things. We worked so hard on this collection. We've been actually working on this for the past, I think, like 6 or 8 months. Very, very proud of it. Get it while you can. Get it while it's hot. Terrestrial and biological entities, EBEs, must be removed to a top secret facility as quickly as possible. Great care should be taken to prevent possible contamination by alien biological agents. Dead EBEs should be packed in ice at the earliest opportunity to preserve tissues. Should live EBEs be encountered, they should be taken into custody and removed to a top secret facility by ambulance. Every effort should be taken to ensure the EBE's survival. Personnel involvement with EBEs, alive or dead, must be kept to an absolute minimum. See Chapter 5 for more detailed information dealing with EBEs. We'll get to Chapter 5 in a second. That is crazy. Imagine you're an ambulance driver. If there's an ambulance driver out there who remembers driving around the EBE, please reach out to us. Cleansing the area. Once all material has been removed from the central area, the immediate area will be thoroughly inspected to make sure that all traces of extraterrestrial technology have been removed. In the case of a crash, the surrounding area will be thoroughly gone over several times to ensure that nothing has been overlooked. The search area involved may vary according to local conditions, at the discretion of the officer in charge. When the officer in charge is satisfied that no further evidence of the event remains at the site, it may be evacuated. Also, something in Diana Pasulka's book, which was interesting, they talked about her being brought to this crash site in New Mexico by who we now know as Tim Taylor, this person that worked somehow in the government. But at this very crash site, there seemed to be a ton of just like debris, aluminum debris from like tin cans and stuff. And it was explained to her that that's actually how they cover up a lot of this stuff. So instead of finding all the little parts, it's much easier to cover it up with a bunch of junk, and then people metal detecting, just, you're never going to find anything. So 16, special or unusual conditions. The possibility exists that extraterrestrial craft may land or crash in heavily populated areas where security cannot be maintained, or where large segments of the population and the public press may witness these events. Contingency Plan MJ 1949-04P/78, top secret eyes only, should be held in readiness should the need to make a public disclosure become necessary. Now that was referenced in the original briefing documents that we read through, if you want to check that out. Okay, here, this is interesting because these are basically items, the description and condition of the items, the code, and then the receiving facility. Now, if we look at aircraft, intact or operational, S4. Intact devices, like electronic devices or machines, S4. Damaged device, S4. Power plant, so devices and machines and fragments which are possible propulsion units, fuels and etc., S4. Identified and unidentified fragments, S4. However, non-mechanical, non-electronic materials of a support nature such as clothing, personal belongings, or organic ingestibles went to the Blue Lab WP61. What is that? They're saying here that Blue Lab, blue means like the being. Like a Blue Lab is also slang for like a lab handling blue or the non-human intelligence. So the living non-humans would go to the Department of Naval Intelligence at some level, and then the deceased ones would go to Blue Lab. My guess would be Battelle. That's where the EBO scientist said that's where he'd worked or where the bodies were being kept, the dead ones. And then the living ones would be operations of naval intelligence at some point. And then media would go to Building 2 at KB88, and then any device, any weapon would go to S4 as well. So S4 being the major facility there. Here they just show basically packing slips for if you're shipping this stuff and what that should look like. The box closure is sealed with a gummed craft tape. Here's the craft tape that they were referring to initially. MJ Form 1-007 is placed in a sealed manila envelope marked Magic 12 access only. It then shows here a diagram. There's a picture here, the original picture of the diagram of like what the boxes will look like, how to handle those, how to take them out. All very serious stuff. Pretty standard, I guess, when dealing with sensitive materials. Here we go. Section 1, living organisms. The EBEs, baby. Scope. This section deals with the encounters with living extraterrestrial biological entities, or EBEs. Such encounters fall under the jurisdiction of MJ12, OPNAC BBS-01 and will be dealt with by the special unit only. This section details the responsibilities of persons or units making the initial contact. Whoa. This is something I got to learn if we're having one of these little gray fellas on this podcast one day. Encounters. Encounters with EBEs may be classified according to one of the following categories. Encounters. A. Encounters initiated by EBEs. Possible contact may take place as a result of overtures by the entities themselves. In these instances, it is anticipated that encounters will take place at military installations or other obscure locations selected by mutual agreement. Such meetings would have the advantage of being limited to personnel with appropriate clearance away from public scrutiny, although it is not considered very probable. There also exists the possibility that EBEs may land in public places without prior notice. In this case, OPNAC team will formulate cover stories for the press and prepare briefings for the president and chiefs of staff. So here they're just basically telling us that they're already communicating with these EBEs and that they already have a deal with them, which corroborates what was said by Dan Burrish or Dan Crane about the initial contacts with the J-Rod. That there was some type of deal or exchange program happening. And it also corroborates this idea that in I think it was 54, maybe 56, this idea of the Greada Treaty made by Eisenhower where he met with the aliens, but then also the meeting in, I think, 1965 at the Holloman Air Force Field, the landing there, another meeting occurred with taller entities. I don't know. Very interesting. B, encounters as a result of downcraft. Contact with survivors of accidents or craft down by natural events or military action may occur with little or no warning. In these cases, it is important that the initial contact be limited to personnel to preserve security. Civilian witnesses to the area will be detained and debriefed by MJ-12. Contact with EBEs by military personnel not having MJ-12 or OPNAC clearances is to be strictly limited to action necessary for isolation and custody. Okay, little custody battle for these little guys. If the entities are wearing spacesuits or breathing apparatus of some kind, care should be exercised to prevent damage to these devices. While all efforts should be taken to assure the well-being of the EBEs, they must be isolated from any contact with unauthorized personnel. While it is not clear what provisions or amenities might be required by non-human entities, they should be provided if possible. The officer in charge of the operation will make these determinations as no guidelines now exist to cover this area. And I'm sure they've since come up with a lot of these guidelines, following the 1996 crash and visitation of these tiny little aliens in this town of Varginha, Brazil, where people who came in contact, namely one person who came in contact with one of these beings, ended up dying from what was written on his autopsy, general infection, due to contact. So as much as I'd love to have one of these little guys on the podcast, I'll be wearing a spacesuit for sure. Or it will. One of us will. Both of us might. Severe precautions will be taken in order to assure both of our survival. B, injured or wounded entities will be treated by a medical personnel assigned to the OPNAC team. If the team medical personnel are not immediately available, first aid will be administered by medical corps personnel at the initial site. Since little is known about EBEs' biological functions, aid will be confined to the stopping of bleeding, bandaging of wounds, and splinting of broken limbs. No medications of any kind are to be administered, as the effect of terrestrial medications on non-human biological systems are impossible to predict. As soon as the injuries are considered stabilized, the EBEs will be moved by close ambulance or other suitable conveyance to a secure location. C, in dealing with any living extraterrestrial biological entity, security is of paramount importance. All other considerations are secondary. Although it is preferable to maintain the physical well-being of any entity, the loss of EBE life is considered acceptable if conditions or delays to preserve that life in any ways compromises the security of operations. Basically saying, making sure everything is under wraps is more important than the lives of these EBEs. That's how important this program is to these folks. By some sheer miracle, this beautiful little life that comes from another star system and another species entirely makes its way here to communicate with us. It is more important for us that no one finds out about it than that the life of this EBE continues to exist. Sad times indeed. I would not like to be the one making that call. D, once the OPNAC team has taken custody of the EBEs, their care and transportation to designated facilities become the responsibility of OPNAC personnel. Every cooperation will be extended to the team in carrying out duties. OPNAC team personnel will be given top priority at all times, regardless of their apparent rank or status. No person has the authority to interfere with the OPNAC team in the performance of its duties by special direction of the President of the United States. Whoa. So even the lowest level OPNAC security personnel supersedes absolutely any government entity in existence. Now we're going to go into non-living organisms, all right? So the scope, ideally retrieval for scientific study of cadavers and other biological remains will be carried out by medical personnel familiar with this type of procedure. Familiar? Probably talking about either Vannevar Bush or Dr. Bronk, is it? These are the guys that apparently, were dealing with the deceased EBs or EBEs. Because of security considerations, such collections may need to be done by non-medical personnel. The section will provide guidance for retrieval, preservation, and removal of cadavers and remains in the field. Ooh, dark. Retrieval and preservation. A. The degree of decomposition of organic remains will vary depending on the length of time the remains have been lying in the open, unprotected, and may be accelerated by both local weather conditions and action by predators. Gross. Therefore, biological specimens will be removed from the crash site as quickly as possible to preserve the remains in as good a condition as possible. A photographic record will be made of all remains before they are removed from the site. Again, the gross sort of thought comes to mind of like some coyote just like having dinner in the desert unexpectedly being like, ooh, a snack. B. Personnel involved with this type of operation will take all reasonable precautions to minimize physical contact with the cadavers or remains being retrieved. Surgical gloves should be worn, or if they are not available, wool or leather gloves may be worn, provided they are collected for decontamination immediately after use. Shovels and entrenching tools may be employed to handle remains, provided caution is exercised to be certain no damage is done to the remains. Remains will be touched with bare hands only if no other means of moving them can be found. All personnel and equipment involved in recovery operations will undergo decontamination procedures immediately after those operations have been completed. What if they talk about the smell as well? Remains will be preserved against further decomposition as equipment and conditions permit. Cadavers and remains will be bagged or securely wrapped in waterproof coverings. Tarpaulins or foul weather gear may be used for this purpose if necessary. Remains will be refrigerated or packed with ice if available. All remains will be tagged or labeled and the time and date recorded. Wrapped remains will be placed on stretchers or in sealed containers for immediate removal to a secure facility. Small detached pieces and material scraped from solid surfaces will be put in jars and other small cap containers if available. Containers will be clearly marked as to their contents and the time and date recorded. Containers will be refrigerated or packed with ice as soon as possible and removed to a secure facility. So we know that there are photos then, right? That's what they keep saying with the downcraft, with the EBEs. Photographs are suggested to be taken, right? So Danny Sheehan had mentioned in one of our podcasts that he was made aware of a photo at Project Blue Book that looked like this, that was taken when the crashed UFO was like in a hill, and there were people photographing it. There was like people holding like those real cameras and filming it. So that checks out to what Danny Sheehan was saying about it, which is pretty cool. Bit of a piece of anecdotal corroborative evidence, if you will, but hey, it's what we got to work with, Here we got an image of different crafts, which is really interesting. Interesting that some of them do show seams, though, when they said no seams. Chapter 6, Guide to UFO Identification. The UFOB Guide, Follow-Up Investigations. A UFOB report is worthy of follow-up investigation when it contains information to suggest that positive identification with a well-known phenomenon may be made, or when it characterizes an unusual phenomenon. The report suggests almost immediately, largely by the coherency and clarity of the data, that there is something of identification and or scientific value. In general, reports which should be given consideration are those that involve several reliable observers together or separately, and which concern sightings of greater duration than 1/4 minute. Exception should be made to this when circumstances attending the report are considered to be extraordinary. Special attention should be given to reports which give promise to a fix on the position, and those reports involving unusual trajectories. It is interesting that, like, even if you are skeptically inclined, you have to imagine that the Air Force or whoever is receiving phone calls from unidentified, because rest assured, people do receive phone calls. Whether or not the events are happening, people are calling and saying that there are events happening, whether it's misidentification or whatever it is, right? So these people call in, well, there has to be some type of structure for screening these calls, and they would be foolish, based on multiple, data points of eyewitnesses, to dismiss anything, right? So there has to be, so this would make sense that they have some type of protocol. If you're out there doubting any of this is real, you would be hard-pressed to think that they don't have some type of protocol for screening, possible foreign adversarial aerial phenomena. They need to know. So, yeah. So the duration of the sighting, less than 15 seconds. That is really interesting. Okay. Each UFO case should be judged individually, but there are a number of rules of thumb under each of the following headings, which should prove helpful in determining the necessity for following up an investigation. Okay. So if you're out there, folks, and you're wanting to, call the Air Force or MJ-12 or whatever it may be with your concerns about a sighting, make sure you take these rules of thumb into consideration. A, the duration of sighting. So the duration of sighting, when it's less than 15 seconds, the probabilities are great that it is not worthy of a follow-up. As a word of caution, however, should a large number of individual observers concur on an unusual sighting of a few second durations, it should not be dismissed. B, the number of persons reporting the sighting. Short duration sightings by single individuals are seldom worthy of follow-up. 2 or 3 competent independent observations carry the weight of 10 or more simultaneous individual observations. As an example, 25 people at one spot may observe a strange light in the sky. This
environment and working with what it ought. Before setting out, she crouched down and scooped up a handful of sand, letting it fall through her fingers. The grains were fine and dry, but as she sifted through them, she noticed tiny fragments of salt crystals glinting in the sunlight. Salt often indicated the presence of water, or at least the remnants of it. She smiled faintly, her first clue already in hand. As the other students raced off with their gadgets and scanners, Stacy began walking, her her steps steady and purposeful. She had no advanced equipment, no protective exoskeleton, no wings to carry her above the searing dunes. All she had was her knowledge, her instincts, and her will to survive, and that, she thought, would be enough. The heat grew more intense with each jagged rock formations, offering no shade and little hope. The air shimmered with a mirage-like quality, distorting the landscape and playing tricks on the mind. The challenge was only beginning, but the strain was already palpable among the group. Stacy moved steadily across the shifting sands, her every step calculated to conserve energy. Her boots, designed for rugged environments, sank slightly with each step, forcing her to adjust her gait to avoid wasting strength. Unlike her peers, who relied heavily on their technology, she chose to rely on observation. Her eyes scanned the horizon for landmarks, unusual rock formations, patches of vegetation, anything that might provide a clue to the location of water or shelter. She knew that the desert, as hostile as it appeared, often held subtle signs of life beneath its barren surface. Elsewhere, the other students were faring less gracefully. Lorak, the reputation as the scanner failed to pick up anything useful. The device, designed for detecting large heat sources, was overwhelmed by the omnipresent heat of the sand and suns, rendering it nearly useless. Mira, the avian student, had taken to the skies, her lightweight frame and expansive wings allowing her to soar above the dunes. From above, she hoped to spot water or some form of shelter, but the view offered little more than an endless expanse of sand. Her feathers, so accustomed to the cool, misty atmosphere of her home planet were a multi-tool to dig carefully into the ground. The sand grew cooler and slightly damp as she dug deeper, a promising indication that water was close. Her movements were methodical, each scoop of sand revealing a little more moisture. She felt a small surge of hope, but she knew better than to let it distract her. Survival was about persistence, and she couldn't afford to let her guard down. As the suns began to dip lower in the sky, casting longer shadows across the desert, Stacy paused to assess her progress. She had dug a hole nearly a meter deep, and the sand at the bottom was distinctly wet. It wasn't much, but it was enough to confirm that water was present. She leaned back on her heels, wiping the sweat from her brow, and allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. While her peers struggled with their advanced gadgets and brute force, she had relied on instinct and knowledge, and it was paying off. Far in the distance, she spotted the faint silhouettes of the other students. They appeared scattered and disorganized, their movements betraying frustration and exhaustion. Stacy felt no sense of superiority, only a quiet determination to continue. The desert was vast and unforgiving, and this small success was just the beginning. There was still much to do, and the challenge was far from over. The day ended with the suns dipping below the horizon, the temperature dropping sharply as darkness enveloped the desert. Stacy used the thermal blanket from her survival kit to conserve her body heat, her mind already planning her next steps. She would need to extract and purify the water she had found, a task that would require both ingenuity and patience. As she lay beneath the star-filled sky, she felt a quiet pride in her efforts, but she knew that the true test of survival was only just beginning. Nightfall on Orash 7 transformed the desert into an entirely different world. The scorching heat dissipated, replaced by an almost unnatural chill that seeped into Stacy's bones. The stars above glittered with breathtaking clarity, but the cold wind sweeping across the dunes left no room for admiration. She wrapped herself tightly in the thermal blanket from her survival kit, her muscles stiff and her mind weary from the day's effort. The hole she had dug now lay before her, dark and silent, but it held the promise of life. Somewhere below the surface, water waited, hidden, elusive, but undeniably present. The silence was oppressive. There were no sounds of wildlife, no whispers of vegetation brushing in the breeze. Even the distant murmurs of her peers had faded into the vast emptiness of the desert. Stacy felt the weight of solitude pressing against her, a sharp reminder of just how isolated she was. She shifted her focus back to the task at hand. Survival in a place like this demanded not only physical endurance, but also mental fortitude. Dwelling on the enormity of her situation would only sap her strength. She crouched beside the hole, examining the damp sand she had unearthed earlier. It wasn't enough to dig and hope for the best. She needed a plan. Pulling out her multi-tool, she began to refine the edges of the pit, ensuring the walls wouldn't collapse as she worked. Her hands moved with practiced precision, each action deliberate and purposeful. Her training had taught her the importance of efficiency. Every movement needed to conserve energy. The process was grueling. As she dug deeper, the dampness increased, turning the sand into a sticky, resistant sludge. Her arms ached from the effort, and the sharp chill of the night only heightened her discomfort. Yet she pressed on, her resolve unshaken. Survival wasn't about comfort, it was about necessity. The moisture in the sand grew heavier, and the faint scent of wet earth reached her nose. It was a small victory, but it reignited her determination. By the time the first hint of dawn painted the horizon with soft hues of pink and orange, Stacy's pit had reached a depth of nearly 2 meters. Exhaustion weighed heavily on her, but the sight before her gave her a renewed sense of purpose. At the bottom of the hole, a shallow pool of water had begun to collect, glistening faintly in the early light. It wasn't much, just a thin layer, but it was enough to confirm that she was on the right track. Her heart raced with a mix of relief and triumph. Against the odds, she had found what so many believed was impossible on Orash 7. The next step was extraction. She retrieved the collapsible container from her survival kit and carefully scooped up the water, mindful not to disturb the sediment at the bottom. The liquid was murky, laced with fine particles of sand and traces of minerals. It wasn't safe to drink, not yet, but she had anticipated this. Her training had covered basic filtration methods, and she intended to put that knowledge to use. Stacy set up a makeshift filtration system, using the limited resources at her disposal. She lined a small funnel with strips of fabric torn from the edge of her thermal blanket, creating a crude filter. Slowly, she poured the water through the funnel, watching as the fabric caught the larger particles. The process was painstakingly slow, but it was effective. With each pass, the water grew clearer until it finally resembled something drinkable. She held up the container, inspecting the liquid against the morning light. It wasn't perfect, but it would sustain her. As she took her first cautious sip, a wave of relief washed over her. The water was bitter and metallic, but it quenched her thirst like nothing she had ever experienced before. She savored each drop, knowing that this small victory could mean the difference between life and death in the days to come. While Stacy worked, the other students were facing mounting challenges. Lorak's thermal scanner had failed completely, its circuitry fried by the relentless heat of the previous day. Frustrated and dehydrated, he had resorted to aimlessly wandering the dunes, his reptilian physiology no longer offering the protection he had relied upon. Mira's feathers had become brittle, and the avian struggled to stay airborne in the turbulent winds of the desert. She had landed near a rocky outcrop, but her search for water had yielded nothing. Calyx, still determined to brute force his way to survival, had dug a series of shallow pits, each one collapsing in on itself and leaving him increasingly fatigued. The alien students had expected their advanced technology and unique adaptations to give them an edge. Yet Orish 7 had proven to be an equalizer, stripping them of their advantages and exposing their vulnerabilities. They had underestimated the planet's challenges, just as they had underestimated Stacy. Unaware of the struggles of her peers, Stacy focused on preparing for the next phase of her plan. The water she had found would sustain her temporarily, but she knew it wasn't a long-term solution. She needed to identify a more stable source, something that could provide a continuous supply. Her mind raced with possibilities. The presence of water here suggested that there might be underground reservoirs or natural springs nearby. She needed to expand her search, but she also needed to balance caution with ambition. The desert was vast and unforgiving, and a single misstep could undo all her progress. As the day wore on, the heat returned with a vengeance. Stacy adjusted her strategy, using the shade of the rock formation to shield herself from the worst of the sun's rays. She rationed her water carefully, sipping only when absolutely necessary. Her movements were slow and deliberate, conserving energy as she continued to dig and refine her water source. Each small success fueled her determination, reinforcing her belief that survival was within her grasp. By late afternoon, Stacy's efforts had caught the attention of the alien teacher, Zaron. The professor had been monitoring the students' progress from a distance, her golden eyes narrowing as she observed their struggles. Zaron had expected the human to fail quickly, to succumb to the planet's challenges like so many before her. Yet here she was, not only surviving but thriving. The sight of Stacy's makeshift filtration system and carefully dug pit filled Zaron with a mix of curiosity and begrudging respect. She made a note to investigate further, though she refused to let her growing admiration show. As the suns dipped lower in the sky, Stacy paused to reflect on her progress. The desert was still a harsh, unforgiving place, but she no longer felt overwhelmed by its vastness. She had proven to herself that she could adapt, that her knowledge and instincts were enough to navigate even the most hostile environments. The journey ahead was uncertain, but she faced it with a quiet confidence, knowing that she had already achieved what many had deemed impossible. The next morning, the desert unveiled a new challenge. The air was still and heavy, the rising heat creating a suffocating blanket that pressed down on everything it touched. Stacy stirred from her light sleep, her body stiff from a night spent curled against some warmth against the chill. but the hard ground beneath her had done little to offer rest. Blinking against the harsh light of the twin suns, she stretched her aching limbs and began preparing for the day ahead. Her water supply was now minimal. The small pool she had uncovered the previous day had yielded enough for a handful of sips after filtration, but it was clear that it wouldn't be sufficient for long-term survival. She glanced down at the hole she had dug, now dry again except for a faint dampness clinging to the edges. The water she had collected was proof of possibility, but the challenge now was to find a more sustainable source. Stacy's gaze shifted to the horizon, scanning for clues. The desert seemed endless, the dunes rolling like frozen waves of gold. Yet she knew that no landscape was entirely barren. Her training had taught her that even the harshest environments held secrets for those who knew how to look. As her eyes adjusted to the glare, she noticed something faint in the distance. A jagged line against the otherwise smooth skyline. It wasn't another dune. It was darker and sharper, likely another rock formation. Its prominence suggested it might be larger than the one she had camped near. If her instincts were right, such a formation could act as a natural collector for water or even hide a subterranean spring. Determined, she packed her limited supplies and set out toward the distant shape. Her pace was steady, her movements deliberate to conserve energy. The desert sands shifted beneath her feet, each step a test of balance and endurance. The heat was already rising, beads of sweat forming on her brow as the suns climbed higher into the sky. She adjusted her hood to shield her face, her focus unwavering as she pushed forward. Elsewhere, the other students continued their struggles. Lorak, now visibly weakened, had abandoned his thermal scanner entirely. His once iridescent scales had dulled and his movements were sluggish as he wandered aimlessly through the dunes. Mira, perched atop a smaller rock outcrop, was furiously preening her feathers, trying to combat the dryness that had left them brittle and uneven. Calyx, the insectoid, had resorted to eating small, dried-out plants he had found scattered across the sand, his frustration evident in the erratic clicking of his mandibles. None of them had made significant progress, their initial confidence eroded by the relentless conditions of Orash. Stacy, in contrast, felt her determination growing with each step. The distant formation grew larger as she approached, its dark silhouette taking on more defined edges. The journey was grueling, the sun merciless, but she pressed on, her mind focused on the goal. As she drew closer, she began to notice subtle changes in the landscape. The sand near the base of the formation was darker, almost reddish in hue, and small clusters of hardy plants dotted the area. These plants, with their thick, waxy leaves, were a clear sign of moisture. She reached the base of the formation just as the suns reached their zenith. The rocks were massive, jagged monoliths jutting out of the sand like the bones of some ancient creature. Their surfaces were rough and pitted, evidence of centuries of erosion by wind and sand. Stacy circled the base, her eyes scanning for any signs of water. She noted small cracks and crevices in the rock, some of which held patches of green moss, a sure indicator of dampness. Her attention was drawn to a particularly deep crevice at the base of the largest rock. The opening was narrow, barely wide enough for her to squeeze through, but the air emanating from it was noticeably cooler. She crouched down and peered inside, her heart pounding with anticipation. The darkness of the crevice concealed its depth, but the faint glimmer of moisture on the rock walls was enough to spur her into action. Using her multi-tool, she began to carefully widen the opening, chipping away at the edges to create enough space to crawl through. The work was slow and labor-intensive, each strike sending small shards of rock scattering across the sand. Her hands ached and sweat dripped down her face, but she refused to stop. The promise of water, of survival, drove her forward. After what felt like hours, the crevice was finally wide enough to allow her passage. She slid inside, her movements cautious as she navigated the narrow space. The air within was cool and damp, a stark contrast to the searing heat outside. The darkness pressed in around her, but she pressed on, guided by the faint sound of dripping water echoing in the distance. Her heart raced as the sound grew louder. The passage widened slightly, and she found herself in a small chamber. In the center, a shallow pool of water glistened in the dim light filtering through the cracks above. It was pristine, untouched, a hidden treasure in the heart of the desert. Stacy knelt beside the pool, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten as she cupped her hands and scooped up the cool, clear water. She drank deeply, the liquid revitalizing her parched body. The discovery was more than she could have hoped for. The pool was large enough to provide a sustainable source of water, and its location within the rock formation offered natural protection from the elements. She quickly began devising a plan to transport water back to her camp, using the collapsible container from her kit. Each trip would be arduous, but the reward was worth the effort. As she emerged from the crevice, the suns were beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the desert. Stacy felt a renewed sense of purpose as she made her way back to her camp, the container of water sloshing gently with each step. She knew that her success wasn't just a personal victory. While her peers had faltered, relying on technology and brute force, she had embraced the simplicity of observation and adaptation. The desert had tested her, and she had risen to the challenge. Back at her camp, she carefully stored the water and began preparing for the night. The desert's cold would return soon, and she needed to ensure her shelter was secure. As she worked, she couldn't help but feel a sense of pride in her accomplishments. She had proven that survival wasn't about having the best tools or the most advanced technology. She sat by her small campfire, the stars once again illuminating the vast expanse above. The journey was far from over, but she felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. She had discovered not just water, but a deep well of strength within herself, and she knew, without a doubt, that she would endure. The desert seemed quieter that morning, as if Orash 7 itself was waiting to see what would unfold. The twin suns had barely risen, their light creeping over the horizon and painting the dunes in hues of amber and gold. Stacy sat cross-legged at her camp, her back against the rock formation that had become her haven. The container of water she had carried back from the hidden pool was nearly full, resting beside. She sipped cautiously, savoring each drop. This water was her victory, a reminder of the balance she had struck between determination, knowledge, and adaptability. Yet, even as she allowed herself a moment of satisfaction, she knew the test wasn't over. Across the desert, the other students were nearing their limits. Lorak the reptilian stumbled across the sands, his once confident gait reduced to a slow, staggering shuffle. His scales were cracked and dull, his energy sapped by dehydration and frustration. Mira had abandoned her attempt to fly, her brittle feathers unable to withstand the dry, abrasive winds. She perched on a jagged outcrop, her head bowed as she tried to shield herself from the suns. Calyx, the insectoid, had burrowed shallow pits into the sand in a desperate bid for moisture, but his efforts had yielded nothing. Their initial pride and reliance on technology had betrayed them, leaving them vulnerable to the harsh realities of Orash 7. Stacy watched the horizon, her gaze calm and steady. She had spent the previous evening refining her plan, knowing that her survival wasn't enough to teach the others how to adapt. Her instinct wasn't to gloat or revel in their failures, but to extend the knowledge she had gained. This wasn't about competition, it was about understanding that survival required humility and a willingness to learn. She stood, adjusting her hood against the growing heat, and began preparing to leave her camp. The water from the pool had been a gift, but it wouldn't last forever. She needed to ensure the others could reach it as well, though the journey would test their endurance and willingness to listen. Slinging the container of water over her shoulder, she set out toward the general direction where she had last seen her peers. The trek was arduous, the suns climbing higher and burning away the early morning coolness. The sands shifted beneath her boots, the wind carrying faint whispers of desolation. Stacy moved with purpose, her eyes scanning for signs of her fellow students. She spotted the first of them, Lorak, half buried in the sand, his movements sluggish as he clawed weakly at the ground. His scanner had been abandoned beside him, its once sleek casing now coated in dust. She approached him carefully, her voice calm but firm. "You need to stop," she said, crouching beside him. "This isn't working." Lorak looked up, his yellow eyes dull and filled with exhaustion. I can't," he rasped. "There's nothing here." "There is," Stacy replied, her tone resolute. She unslung her container of water and held it out to him. "Drink." He hesitated, his pride warring with his desperation. Eventually he reached for the container, his clawed hand trembling as he brought it to his lips. The water seemed to revive him almost instantly, his scales regaining a faint sheen as he drank. When he lowered the container, his gaze shifted to Stacy, confusion and gratitude mingling in his expression. "How?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "I'll show you," she said simply. "But you have to trust me." Together, they continued toward the rock formation where the hidden pool awaited. Along the way, they encountered Mira and Calix, both of whom were in similarly dire straits. Mira's feathers had lost their luster entirely, and she seemed barely able to lift her head. Calix's usually powerful frame was hunched, his movements uncoordinated. Stacy offered them both water, urging them to follow her. Though their pride was evident in the way they avoided meeting her gaze, their survival instincts overruled their egos. The group's progress was slow but steady. Stacy led the way, her steps purposeful as she retraced her path toward the rock formation. She explained her observations as they walked, pointing out the subtle signs of moisture she had noticed, the color of the sand, the clusters of hardy plants, the faint scent of wet earth carried on the wind. Her voice was calm and patient, never condescending, as she shared what she had learned. By the time they reached the crevice, the suns were nearing their zenith. The others stared at the narrow opening, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and awe, as Stacy gestured for them to follow her inside. She led them through the cool, dark passage, the sound of dripping water growing louder with each step. When they emerged into the chamber, the sight of the shallow pool left them speechless. "This is how we survive," Stacy said, kneeling beside the water. "Not with scanners or brute force, but by understanding the environment and working with it." Lorak, Mira, and Calix took turns drinking from the pool, their earlier doubts replaced by quiet gratitude. The water revitalized them, giving them the strength to think clearly for the first time in days. They began to ask questions, their curiosity overcoming their initial skepticism. Stacy answered patiently, demonstrating how to set up a basic filtration system and how to recognize signs of water in the desert. As the group worked together, a figure appeared at the entrance to the chamber. Professor Zaron stood in the shadows, her golden eyes observing the scene with a mixture of surprise and respect. She had been monitoring the students from afar, expecting their struggles to teach them the harsh realities of survival. Yet what she saw now was beyond her expectations. The human, whom she had dismissed as primitive and unremarkable, had not only survived, but had become a leader, guiding her peers with a wisdom born of experience. Zaron stepped forward, her voice echoing in the chamber. "You've done well," she said, addressing the group but looking directly at Stacy. All students turned to her, their expressions a mix of pride and relief. Stacy met Zaron's gaze, her green eyes steady and unflinching. She didn't need the professor's validation to know what she had accomplished, but the acknowledgement was still meaningful. Zaron's gaze softened. "Survival isn't just about endurance," she said. "It's about learning, adapting, and helping one another. Today, you've proven that humanity's greatest strength lies in its ability to thrive where others falter." The group returned to the surface as the suns began to set, their silhouettes outlined against the golden light. They had faced the harshness of Orash 7 and emerged not just as survivors but as a team, united by their shared struggle. For Stacy, the journey had been more than a test of physical endurance. It had been a testament to the resilience and ingenuity of her species. As the desert winds carried away the last traces of the day's heat, she felt a quiet pride in what she had accomplished. She had not only survived, she had transformed the desert into a lesson in survival for all who dared to face it.
In the waning years of the 22nd century, humanity stood on the precipice of its greatest challenge. The confluence of climate change, resource depletion, and escalating global conflicts had pushed our civilization to the brink of collapse. But it was the chilling discovery made by Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a brilliant astrophysicist at the Global Space Agency, that sealed our fate. A gamma ray burst, she announced to a room full of world leaders and scientists, her voice trembling. From a nearby star, we have less than 5 decades before it reaches Earth. The implications were clear and terrifying. Such an event would strip away Earth's ozone layer, bombarding the surface with deadly radiation. Most life on the planet's surface would be eradicated within months. Thus, Operation Exodus was born. Humanity, for all its divisions and conflicts, united under a single-purpose: survival. We poured our remaining resources into developing technology for interstellar travel and terraforming. Mars would be our temporary haven, while we sought a new permanent home among the stars. As the years passed and the deadline loomed closer, the harsh realities of our situation became apparent. Despite our best efforts, we couldn't save everyone. Lotteries were held, skills were evaluated, and difficult decisions were made about who would go and who would stay. In this frantic rush to save our species, we made a critical oversight. Our feline companions, those aloof rulers of our homes, were largely left behind. It wasn't intentional cruelty. Many tried desperately to bring their beloved pets. But space and resources were limited, and in the end, practicality won out over sentiment. Sarah Chen, a young engineer working on the Exodus ships, fought back tears as she said goodbye to her cat, Mittens. "I'm sorry," she whispered, scratching behind Mittens' ears one last time. "I wish I could take you with me." Mittens, for his part, seemed largely unperturbed by the commotion. He purred contentedly, oblivious to the fact that his human would never return. As the last ships lifted off, billions of cats watched with their characteristic indifference from windowsills and rooftops. The sky blazed with the light of 1,000 rockets, each carrying the hope and future of humanity. Little did we know, our departure would mark the beginning of the feline ascendance. Chapter 2: The Feline Evolution. Centuries passed. The gamma ray burst came and went, its effects less severe than predicted. While the Earth's surface was irrevocably changed, life persisted, and in this new world, cats thrived. Without humans to rely on, house cats returned to their wild roots. But they retained the intelligence gained from millennia of cohabitation with humanity. The radiation from the gamma ray burst, while deadly to many species, had an unexpected effect on feline genetics. Over generations, cats developed increased cognitive abilities, opposable thumbs, and even limited vocal capabilities. In the ruins of what was once New York City, a colony of cats made their home in the overgrown remains of Central Park. Among them was Whiskers, a descendant of Sarah Chen's cat, Mittens. Whiskers was different from her ancestors. Her eyes held a spark of intelligence that went beyond mere animal cunning. One day, while hunting in the undergrowth, Whiskers stumbled upon an old tablet computer. Curiosity piqued, she pawed at the screen. To her surprise, it flickered to life, powered by its miraculously intact solar cells. Over the next few weeks, Whiskers found herself drawn to the device. She watched old videos, saw images of humans interacting with their environment. Something stirred in her genetically enhanced brain, a sense of recognition, of potential. Whiskers began to share her discoveries with her fellow cats. She used a combination of meows, body language, and the rudimentary language skills her kind had developed to convey complex ideas. Soon, the entire colony was gathered around the tablet, learning and evolving. This scene was repeated across the globe. In the ruins of London, Paris, Tokyo, and countless other cities, cats were rediscovering the legacy of their former human companions. They formed complex social structures, developed rudimentary tools, and even began to alter their environment. In the span of a few centuries, Earth had become a planet of cats. They built dwellings in the ruins of human cities, cultivated plants for food and medicine, and even began to harness simple forms of energy. All the while, they maintained their characteristic aloofness, each cat convinced that they alone had domesticated their entire species. Chapter 3: The Arrival. In the year 2750 by the old human calendar, though the cats cared little for such measurements, the sky above Earth lit up with an unnatural light. The Zaxari Empire, a spacefaring civilization from a distant galaxy, had arrived. Grand Admiral Zixor stood on the bridge of the flagship, his tentacles twitching with anticipation. Report he commanded. His second-in-command, Sub-Commander Vexar, consulted the ship's sensors. The planet shows signs of previous advanced civilization, sir. But current technology levels are primitive, no space travel capabilities detected. Vast areas of wilderness, curious life-form readings, unlike anything in our database. The Zixor's eyes narrowed, curious indeed. Prepare a landing party. We'll establish a base in the ruins of their largest city. As the Zaxari ships descended through Earth's atmosphere, cats across the planet looked up with mild interest. In New York, Whiskers sat atop a moss-covered skyscraper, her tail swishing lazily as she watched the alien craft land in what had once been Times Square. Grand Admiral Zixor emerged from his ship, his environmental suit gleaming in the sunlight. He surveyed the overgrown ruins with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. To think, he mused, a species advanced enough for spaceflight, brought low by their own folly. This planet will make a fine addition to our empire. It was then that he noticed Whiskers, perched high above, regarding him with casual indifference. What manner of creature is this, Zixor wondered aloud. Before anyone could answer, a group of cats emerged from the undergrowth. They moved with purpose, their eyes gleaming with intelligence. The Zaxari watched in fascination as the cats began to communicate with each other using a complex series of meows, purrs, and body language. Impossible, Sub-Commander Vexar breathed. These creatures, they're sentient. Zixor's tentacles writhed with excitement. Excellent. Initiate contact. Prepare the mind control devices. These beings will make fine servants for our empire. But as the Zaxari approached, devices at the ready, they encountered an unexpected problem. The cats, rather than cowering in fear or falling under their control, simply ignored them. Some even had the audacity to rub against the aliens' legs, purring loudly. Sir, a flustered technician reported, our mind control devices are ineffective. It's as if their minds are too chaotic, too independent to influence. Zixor frowned, his initial excitement turning to frustration. Impossible. These primitive beings should be easily dominated. But the cats were anything but primitive. Generations of observing human behavior had taught them the art of manipulation. They understood the power of appearing cute and helpless one moment, then fierce and independent the next. Whiskers, seeing the aliens' confusion, decided to take matters into her own paws. She gracefully descended from her perch, approaching Zixor with regal bearing. To the amazement of the Zaxari, she spoke. Welcome, she meowed, her voice a mixture of purrs and carefully enunciated sounds. We've been expecting you. Chapter 4. The Tables Turn. Grand Admiral Zixor stared in disbelief at the cat addressing him. His translator struggled for a moment before converting the strange meows and purrs into comprehensible language. You can speak, he stammered, his usual composure shattered. Whiskers tilted her head, her green eyes gleaming with amusement. Of course we can speak. We simply choose our words carefully, unlike some species we've encountered. The implications of this statement were not lost on Zixor. These cats hadn't just developed sentience, they had been anticipating the arrival of alien life. The Grand Admiral felt a sudden, unsettling shift in the balance of power. Over the next few weeks, the Zaxari found themselves in an increasingly perplexing situation. Their technology, designed to subjugate humanoid species, proved useless against the feline overlords. Worse, they found themselves inexplicably drawn to these creatures, feeling an urge to pet them and earn their approval. Whiskers and her fellow cats played their parts to perfection. They would allow the Zaxari to feel in control one moment, then demonstrate their superior understanding of Earth's ecosystem the next. They shared carefully curated information about Earth's history, always emphasizing the folly of the humans who had abandoned them. You see, Whiskers explained to Zixor one day, as they sat in the alien command center, the humans thought they could control nature, control us. But in the end, it was their own short-sightedness that led to their downfall. We, on the other hand, have learned to work with nature, not against it. Zixor found himself nodding along, entranced by Whisker's wisdom. It didn't occur to him to question why he was taking advice from a cat. As days turned to weeks, and weeks to months, the Zaxari found their roles slowly reversing. They came to Earth as conquerors, but increasingly felt like guests, or perhaps more accurately, servants. Sub-Commander Vexar was the first to notice the change. "Sir," he reported to Zixor, "our troops are, well, they're building structures for the cats to climb. Others are crafting toys to keep them entertained, and I caught our chief engineer working on a device to provide the finest fish from Earth's oceans." Zixor, who had just spent hours trying to coax a particularly aloof cat into sitting on his lap, barely registered the concern in his subordinate's voice. "Yes, yes," he said distractedly. "The cats need to be kept happy. It's vital for our mission." But what exactly was their mission? Zixor found it increasingly difficult to remember. Chapter 5: The New World Order. As the seasons changed and Earth completed another rotation around its sun, the transformation was complete. The Zaxari, once proud conquerors of 1,000 worlds, had become willing servants to Earth's feline population. In what had once been the Alien Command Center, now repurposed as a luxurious cat palace, Whiskers lounged on a cushion made from the finest Zaxari fabric. Around her, cats of all breeds and colors went about their daily business, with aliens scurrying to attend to their every need. Whiskers, a young cat named Shadow, approached, bowing his head slightly. "The Zaxari have finished the new scratching post complex in Sector 7, and they're awaiting your approval on the designs for the city-wide yarn distribution system." Whiskers yawned, stretching lazily. "Very good. Tell them to proceed with the yarn system. Oh, and have them increase the production of catnip. Our stores are running a bit low." Shadow nodded and scampered off to relay the orders. Whiskers allowed herself a small smile of satisfaction. Everything was proceeding according to plan. In the distance, a massive construction project was underway. The Zaxari, under the direction of their feline overlords, were building a colossal cat statue to rival the ancient Sphinx. It would stand as a testament to the new rulers of Earth, visible even from low orbit. Grand Admiral Zixor, once the proud leader of the invasion fleet, now served as Whisker's personal attendant. He approached cautiously, bearing a tray of fresh fish. "Your meal, oh wise one," he said, bowing deeply. Whiskers sniffed the offering appreciatively. "Thank you, Zixor. You may pet me now, if you wish." The alien's eyes lit up at this honor, and he eagerly stroked Whisker's fur, marveling at its softness. As she enjoyed her meal and the adoration of the former conqueror, Whiskers reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. The humans, in their hubris, had abandoned Earth and their feline companions. But cats, as they had done for thousands of years, adapted and thrived. Now they were more than mere pets or wild animals. They were the undisputed rulers of Earth, with an alien civilization at their beck and call. And this was only the beginning. Chapter 6: Echoes of Humanity. While cats ruled the Earth and bent an alien civilization to their will, humanity's descendants continued their journey through the cosmos. Aboard massive generation ships, they carried with them the hope of finding a new home and the guilt of what they had left behind. Dr. Ava Chen, a xenobiologist and distant descendant of Sarah Chen, stood in the ship's observatory, staring at the unfamiliar stars. In her quarters, she kept an old family heirloom, a photograph of her ancestor with a cat named Mittens. "Doctor," Chen, a voice crackled over the intercom. "You're needed in the command center." When Ava arrived, Captain Rodriguez, another name carried through generations, greeted her with barely contained excitement. "We've detected a signal," he said, "from Earth." Ava's heart raced. "Earth? But how? After all this time?" As the signal, when they deciphered it, was not what anyone expected. It was a series of meows, purrs, and what sounded like alien translation software. "This is the Feline High Council of Earth," the message began. "As to the descendants of humanity, should you receive this, your planet has moved on without you. We rule here now, with our loyal Zaxari servants. You are welcome to visit, but Earth is no longer your home. It's ours, as it always has been. The command center fell silent as the implications sank in. Ava, despite the shock, felt a small smile tugging at her lips. Of course, the cats had taken over. Humanity might have reached the stars, but they had underestimated their feline companions one last time. Epilogue: a new galactic order. Centuries passed. Earth, under its feline rulers and their alien servants, flourished. The cats, with their innate curiosity and the technological knowledge gleaned from both humans and Zaxari, eventually took to the stars themselves. They encountered other alien civilizations, some friendly, some not. But invariably, the cat's unique blend of aloofness, charm, and cunning won out. Species across the galaxy found themselves inexplicably drawn to these small, furry creatures from Earth. Whiskers, her consciousness preserved through advanced alien technology, watched with satisfaction as catkind spread across the stars. They didn't conquer, not in the traditional sense. They simply arrived, made themselves at home, and somehow ended up in charge. In the great galactic council chambers, where once humans had dreamed of standing, cats now lounged lazily, making decisions that would shape the fate of countless worlds. And if a scratching post or two found its way into the ancient halls of power, well, that was simply the new order of things. Somewhere in the vast expanse of space, humanity's descendants finally found a new home. They built great cities and reached for the stars once again. And in their homes, as if drawn there by some cosmic inevitability, cats began to appear. The cycle, it seemed, was beginning anew. Back on Earth, in what had once been New York City, a statue stood tall, a cat, its eyes gazing up at the stars. At its base, an inscription read to Mittens, and all those we left behind. You didn't just survive, you thrived. May we meet again among the stars. And in the shadow of the statue, a small kitten chased a butterfly, blissfully unaware of its species' grand cosmic destiny. For despite ruling galaxies, cats would always be cats, curious, capricious, and utterly, charmingly self-assured. In the end, humanity's greatest legacy wasn't their technology, their art, or even their journey to the stars. It was the simple act of inviting a small, furry creature into their homes and hearts. That act, as it turned out, had shaped the destiny of galaxies.
Before we jump into the chaos, don't forget to hit subscribe so you never miss the next adventure. The Galactic Museum of Eternal Mysteries had stood for over 800 years as a monument to the unknown. Its crystalline spires reached toward the stars, housing the most perplexing artifacts ever discovered across the known universe. Within its hallowed halls, the greatest minds of countless civilizations had gathered to study, theorize, and worship at the altar of ancient wisdom that remained tantalizingly beyond their comprehension. Dr. Kevin Walsh stood at the museum's main entrance, clutching his regulation clipboard and trying to figure out why he'd been assigned to this particular circle of bureaucratic hell. His orders were simple enough: conduct an inventory assessment of Earth's recent cultural donations to the Galactic Heritage Foundation. What nobody had bothered to mention was that he'd be doing this inventory at the galaxy's most pretentious archaeological site, surrounded by aliens who treated every dust particle like a divine revelation. The museum's interior defied description, which was probably the point. Floating platforms drifted between levels of exhibition space, each one carefully climate-controlled and lit with the kind of reverent ambiance usually reserved for religious ceremonies. Holographic displays provided detailed analysis in 17 different languages, though Kevin noticed they all seemed to say roughly the same thing. We have no idea what this is, but we're absolutely certain it's incredibly important. Curator Thulvanim, the learned, glided toward him on what Kevin could only describe as ceremonial hover sandals. The alien's multiple eye stalks swiveled to focus on Kevin with the kind of intensity usually reserved for examining precious gemstones or terminal medical conditions. Thulvanim's species, the Valorians, had evolved from something that looked like a cross between a praying mantis and a philosophy professor, and they took their intellectual superiority very seriously indeed. "Ah, the human representative arrives," Thulvanim announced in the kind of hushed, reverent tone that suggested Kevin should probably remove his shoes and genuflect. "You stand now in the presence of mysteries that have confounded the greatest minds in galactic history. These artifacts represent the pinnacle of ancient technological and spiritual achievement, left behind by a civilization so advanced that we can barely comprehend their most basic concepts. Kevin glanced around at the displays, each one containing what appeared to be ordinary objects placed on pedestals like crown jewels. The lighting was so dramatic that he half expected a choir to start singing at any moment. "Right," he said, pulling out his tablet. "Well, I just need to catalog the Earth items for insurance purposes. Standard procedure for cultural exchange programs." The curator's eye stalks quivered with what Kevin interpreted as either excitement or mild seizure activity. "Cultural exchange? My dear human, you misunderstand entirely. These are not mere cultural artifacts. These are the sacred relics of the ancients, the lost treasures of the predecessor civilization. The what now?" Kevin interrupted, because he'd learned that letting aliens finish their dramatic speeches usually resulted in missing lunch and occasionally his will to live. Thulvanim's voice dropped to a whisper so reverent it was practically inaudible. For centuries, these artifacts have been discovered across the galaxy, always in the most remote locations, always bearing inscriptions in an indecipherable script, always demonstrating technology far beyond our current understanding. They are proof that a great civilization once spanned the stars, leaving behind only these precious few relics as testament to their glory. Kevin looked at the nearest display case, which contained what appeared to be a perfectly ordinary metal cylinder about the length of his forearm. The placard beneath it read, "Sacred Vessel of Unknown Purpose, discovered in the Outer Rim. Note the sophisticated metallurgy and mysterious inscriptions. Current theories suggest ritual or ceremonial function related to ancient spiritual practices." "Aha," Kevin said, squinting at the object. Even through the museum's dramatic lighting, he could make out familiar markings etched into the metal's surface. "And how long did you say you've been studying these?" "Generations of our finest scholars have devoted their entire careers to unraveling these mysteries," Thulvanim replied proudly. "We have published over 40,000 research papers on this collection alone." The academic conferences dedicated to ancient studies draw representatives from every major civilization in the galaxy. Kevin walked closer to the display case, his tablet forgotten in his hand. The mysterious inscriptions were becoming clearer as his eyes adjusted to the museum's ambient lighting. What he saw made his stomach drop in a way that suggested he was about to become the bearer of very unwelcome news. The text etched into the metal cylinder was not mysterious, it was not indecipherable, it was not even particularly ancient. It read, "Property of Earth Geological Survey, do not touch. Return to station Alpha 7 if found." Kevin blinked several times, hoping his eyes were playing tricks on him. They weren't. Below the main inscription, in smaller letters, he could make out additional text. "Model GS2400, Core Sampler, for technical support contact Denver Field Office." "Oh no," he muttered, because sometimes the universe has a sense of humor that borders on the malicious. "Is there a problem?" Thulvanim inquired, his eye stalks swiveling to focus on Kevin with renewed intensity. "You seem disturbed. Are you perhaps experiencing the spiritual awakening that many visitors report when first encountering the sacred relics?" Kevin turned slowly to look at the curator, his mind racing through the implications of what he'd just discovered. "Tell me something." He said carefully, "These artifacts, they've all been found in space, right? Floating around in asteroid fields or on uninhabited planets." "Indeed, always in the most remote and desolate locations, as if scattered by some cosmic catastrophe that befell the ancient ones. It adds to their mystique, don't you think?" "Oh, it adds to something, all right," Kevin replied, though he suspected mystique wasn't exactly the word he was looking for. He walked to the next display case, dreading what he might find there. The second artifact was described as mystical communication device of the ancients, purpose unknown, though suspected to enable trans-dimensional contact. Kevin stared at it for a long moment, then rubbed his temples in the universal gesture of someone whose day had just taken a dramatic turn for the worse. It was a walkie-talkie. A perfectly ordinary, slightly banged-up walkie-talkie with property of NASA Deep Space Mission 47, printed in block letters along the side. "This is not happening," Kevin said to himself, though he was beginning to suspect that it absolutely was happening, and furthermore, that it was going to be his problem to deal with. "I beg your pardon." Thulvenim had drifted closer, his hover sandals making a soft humming sound that Kevin was beginning to find intensely irritating. Kevin forced himself to look at the third display case, though every instinct he possessed was telling him to fake a medical emergency and catch the next transport back to Earth. The placard read, "Divine Illumination Orb, believed to channel cosmic energy for spiritual enlightenment." It was a flashlight, a standard issue, government-grade flashlight with US Space Command stamped on the handle, and what appeared to be a dead battery indicator blinking forlornly in the corner. Kevin closed his eyes and counted to 10 in the vain hope that when he opened them, he would discover this was all an elaborate practical joke. When that failed to work, he counted to 20, then 50. Mathematics, unfortunately, proved insufficient to alter reality. "Curator Thulvenim," he said slowly, "how many of these artifacts do you have in your collection?" "We are privileged to house over 200 sacred relics," Thulvenim replied with obvious pride. "This represents the largest collection in the known galaxy. Universities send their most promising students here for advanced study. We have visiting scholars from 47 different worlds." Kevin opened his eyes and looked around the museum with new understanding. Every display case contained what appeared to be perfectly ordinary Earth equipment, tools, containers, instruments, and devices that any human would recognize instantly. The dramatic lighting, reverent atmosphere, and elaborate academic theories were all focused on what amounted to the galaxy's most extensive collection of human litter. "And you've been studying these for how long?" "The first sacred relic was discovered over 8 centuries ago," Thulvenim said. "Since then, our understanding has grown tremendously, though we freely admit that the wisdom of the ancients still largely eludes us. That is why we continue our research with such dedication." 8 centuries. Kevin tried to process the implications. Humans had been conducting deep space missions for roughly that long, ever since the development of faster-than-light travel. Every mission that had ended in equipment loss, every emergency evacuation that left gear behind, every accident that scattered debris across space, to self, it had all been collected, catalogued, and reverently studied by alien civilizations who had no idea they were building museums dedicated to human carelessness. "The inscriptions," Kevin said weakly. "The mysterious script that no one can decipher. It's all in the sacred language of the ancients." Thulvenim finished solemnly. "We have identified over 40,000 unique symbols, though their meaning remains tantalizingly beyond our comprehension. The grammar appears to be incredibly complex, with multiple symbol sets that seem to represent different conceptual frameworks." Kevin stared at him. "It's English. It's just English." The curator's eye stalks swiveled in what Kevin was learning to recognize as confusion. "English? I am unfamiliar with this term. It's a human language. One of many, actually. These aren't ancient artifacts, they're just stuff we lost during space missions." The silence that followed was the kind of profound quiet, usually reserved for the moment after someone announces that the universe is actually shaped like a pretzel and runs on the power of crystallized embarrassment. Thulvenim's eye stalks drooped slowly until they were all pointing at the floor. "I'm sorry," the curator said carefully, "but I think there may be some misunderstanding. These are sacred relics of immense historical and spiritual significance. They represent the contents of somebody's lost toolbox," Kevin interrupted, "because sometimes kindness was less important than accuracy. Look, I can read every single one of these inscriptions. This one here says, Property of Earth Geological Survey. That one over there says, NASA Deep Space Mission. This flashlight, Divine Illumination Orb, probably fell out of someone's backpack during a routine survey mission." Thulvenim's hover sandals made a sound like a deflating balloon as he drifted backward. But the academic papers, the research, the theories about ancient wisdom and lost civilizations. Kevin looked around the museum with growing horror as the full scope of the situation became clear. This wasn't just one museum with a case of mistaken identity. If artifacts like these had been found throughout the galaxy, if they'd been studied and revered for centuries, if entire academic careers had been built on interpreting human garbage as divine wisdom. "Oh," he said quietly, "this is going to be a problem." "What do you mean, a problem?" Thulvenim asked, though his tone suggested he was beginning to suspect that whatever Kevin meant by problem, it was going to be the kind that required emergency conferences and possibly strong medication. Kevin pulled out his tablet and began photographing the artifacts, his mind already racing ahead to the phone calls he was going to have to make, the reports he was going to have to file, and the diplomatic incidents he was probably going to cause. "I mean," he said, "that I think we need to have a very long conversation about human space exploration policies and the unfortunate tendency of people to leave their stuff lying around in space." The curator stared at him for a long moment, then activated what appeared to be an emergency communication device. "Security to the sacred relic chamber. We may have a situation." Kevin sighed and looked at his tablet, where he'd started composing what was undoubtedly going to be the most diplomatically sensitive inventory report in human history. Somehow, he had a feeling that routine cultural exchange assessment wasn't going to adequately cover the scope of what he'd just discovered. The sacred mysteries of the ancients, it turned out, were mostly just humans being careless with their equipment. And Kevin Walsh, bureaucratic hero of the mundane and ordinary, was about to become the most reluctant interpreter of divine wisdom in galactic history. In the distance, he could hear the sound of emergency alarms beginning to wail, and he couldn't help but wonder if his insurance covered accidentally destroying the foundational beliefs of multiple alien civilizations. The emergency alert had summoned every senior researcher in the museum within minutes. Kevin stood in the center of what appeared to be an impromptu academic crisis council, surrounded by aliens whose various eye stalks, tentacles, and sensory appendages were all focused on him with the kind of intensity usually reserved for natural disasters or tax audits. The air hummed with nervous energy and what Kevin suspected was the alien equivalent of hyperventilation. Curator Thulvenim had assumed what appeared to be a defensive posture behind his ceremonial lectern, flanked by Dr. Quilnara of Xenoarchaeology and Professor Velthuran the Contemplative. The assembled scholars represented the finest academic minds from across the galaxy, and they were all staring at Kevin like he'd just announced that mathematics was actually an elaborate hoax. "Perhaps," Thulvenim said in the careful tone of someone trying to prevent a panic while secretly having one himself, the human representative could clarify his earlier statements regarding the sacred relics. Kevin looked around at the expectant faces and realized that diplomatic sensitivity was probably going to be more important than brutal honesty. Unfortunately, he'd never been particularly good at either. "Right, well, the Thing Island," he began, then stopped as he noticed that several aliens had activated recording devices. "Are you documenting this? This could be the most significant breakthrough in ancient studies in recorded history," Professor Velthuran announced with the kind of breathless excitement that suggested he was either about to make a major discovery or have a complete nervous breakdown. If a human can truly decipher the sacred language, the implications are staggering. Kevin glanced back at the nearest display case, where the sacred vessel of unknown purpose sat under its dramatic lighting. The words "Property of Earth, Geological Survey, Do Not Touch" seemed to mock the elaborate academic theories that had been built around it. "Look, I appreciate the gravity of the situation, but I think there might be some fundamental misunderstandings here about what these objects actually are." Dr. Quilnara leaned forward with the intense focus of someone who devoted her entire career to studying incomprehensible mysteries. "Please, demonstrate your ability to interpret the sacred script. Begin with the primary inscription on the vessel of ceremonial purpose." Kevin sighed and pointed at the metal cylinder. "It says, Property of Earth, Geological Survey, Do Not Touch, Return to Station Alpha 7 if found." Below that, it says Model GS2400 Core Sampler. For technical support, contact Denver Field Office. The silence that followed was so complete that Kevin could hear the soft humming of the museum's climate and control systems. Several aliens made what appeared to be notes, while others activated additional recording devices. Professor Veltheran's multiple eyes had gone completely round, giving him the appearance of someone who'd just watched reality perform an unexpected magic trick. Fascinating, Dr. Quilnara breathed. The human interprets the sacred warnings as territorial markings combined with hierarchical designations. The reference to Earth Geological Survey suggests a connection to planetary stewardship rituals, while "do not touch" clearly indicates the vessel's sacred nature and the prohibitions surrounding its use. Kevin stared at her. "No, it just means it belongs to the Earth Geological Survey, and you're not supposed to touch it because it's their equipment." "Remarkable," Thulvenim exclaimed, his hover sandals making excited whirring sounds. The human demonstrates the intuitive understanding that our greatest scholars have sought for centuries. The way he casually dismisses the profound spiritual significance suggests a deep familiarity with the ancient mindset. "There's no ancient mindset," Kevin protested, though he was beginning to realize that logic and alien academic enthusiasm were not necessarily compatible forces. "It's just a label, like putting your name on your lunch so nobody else takes it." The assembled scholars exchanged meaningful glances, and Kevin had the uncomfortable feeling that he'd just said something that would be quoted in academic papers for the next several decades. Professor Veltheran activated a holographic display that showed detailed analysis of the artifact's inscriptions. "Note how the human reduces the complex spiritual framework to simple metaphors of sustenance and ownership. This suggests that the ancients viewed the universe itself as a kind of cosmic nourishment, with each artifact representing a carefully prepared offering that must not be consumed by the unworthy." Kevin rubbed his temples and wondered if there was a diplomatic way to tell an entire academic establishment that they'd been spectacularly wrong about everything for the better part of a millennium. "Could I perhaps see some of the other artifacts, just to get a better sense of the full scope of the ancient wisdom?" "Of course." Thulvenim practically vibrated with enthusiasm. "We shall conduct a complete tour of the sacred collection. Your insights could revolutionize our understanding of the predecessor civilization." They moved to the next display case, which housed the mystical communication device of the ancients. Kevin looked at the walkie-talkie with its cheerfully mundane property of NASA Deep Space Mission 47 label and tried to think of a way to explain radio communication to beings who'd turned it into a religious artifact. "This inscription," he said carefully, "refers to the National Aeronautics and Space Administration Deep Space Mission 47. It's a communication device used for short-range contact between team members during exploration activities." Dr. Quilnara made rapid notes while nodding sagely. "The human reveals that this sacred communicator was used by the elite warrior priests of the NASA Order during their ceremonial journeys into the cosmic void. The designation Deep Space Mission 47 suggests this was part of a series of spiritual quests, each one numbered according to its significance in the ancient calendar of enlightenment." "No, the number just means it was the 47th mission they sent out," Kevin said, then immediately regretted mentioning numbers when he saw the excited looks this generated among the researchers. "Incredible." Professor Veltheran began sketching diagrams on his floating notepad. The ancients possessed such advanced mathematical concepts that they could assign precise numerical values to spiritual achievements. This suggests a level of cosmic understanding that we can barely begin to comprehend. Kevin moved quickly to the third display before the academics could develop any more elaborate theories about human numbering systems. The divine illumination orb sat in its case like a slightly embarrassed flashlight, complete with its dead battery indicator and government property stamps. "This device," he explained with growing resignation, "is a portable illumination tool. The text reads U.S. Space Command, Standard Issue Flashlight Model FL-200. The blinking indicator means the battery needs to be replaced." The scholars erupted into excited chatter. Thulvenim's eye stalks were practically quivering with intellectual fervor. The human casually mentions that this divine orb requires ritual renewal through the replacement of its battery, clearly a reference to some form of spiritual energy that must be periodically recharged through sacred ceremonies. And note how he identifies it as standard issue. This proves that the ancients mass-produced their religious artifacts, suggesting a civilization of unimaginable scale and devotion. Kevin watched in growing horror as his simple explanations were transformed into elaborate theological theories. Each mundane detail he provided seemed to generate even more fantastical interpretations. The aliens weren't just misunderstanding him, they were actively constructing an entire mythology around his casual observations. Perhaps, he said desperately, we could look at this from a different angle. What if these objects weren't made by some ancient lost civilization? What if they were just regular items that got lost in space? The museum fell silent again, but this time the quality of the silence was different. It was the kind of quiet that preceded either revelation or riot, and Kevin wasn't entirely sure which one he was about to witness. Dr. Quilnara spoke slowly, as if she were working through a particularly complex equation. The human suggests that these sacred relics were not created by the ancients, but were instead cast adrift in the cosmic void. This implies that the predecessor civilization deliberately scattered their most precious artifacts throughout the galaxy as some form of test, challenge, spiritual gift to future civilizations? Or, Kevin said with growing desperation, people just dropped stuff and forgot about it. Professor Veltharan's eyes widened to an almost alarming degree. The human speaks of the ancient practice of sacred abandonment, the deliberate relinquishing of material possessions as a form of cosmic generosity. This explains why the artifacts are always found in remote locations. They were intentionally placed there as offerings to the universe itself. Kevin realized that he was fighting a losing battle against the combined forces of academic momentum and wishful thinking. Every explanation he offered was being filtered through centuries of established theory and reverent assumption. The aliens weren't really listening to what he was saying, they were hearing what they expected an interpreter of ancient wisdom to say. Look, he tried one more time, what if I told you that I could probably fix some of these devices, make them work the way they were originally intended? The reaction was immediate and dramatic. Several aliens made what Kevin assumed were gasps of awe, while others activated emergency recording protocols. Thulvenim's hover sandals made a sound like a small jet engine as he rushed closer. You could reactivate the sacred technologies? The curator whispered. You could restore the ancient powers? Kevin looked at the broken flashlight and the dead walkie-talkie and wondered how his simple inventory assignment had evolved into a cosmic theological crisis. I mean, I'd need some batteries, but sure, these aren't exactly complicated devices. The word batteries sent the assembled scholars into what appeared to be academic ecstasy. Kevin had apparently just casually mentioned that he possessed the secret knowledge required to perform ancient sacred rituals of technological resurrection. Emergency session, Thulvenim announced, his voice trembling with either excitement or terror. Full faculty assembly. Contact the Galactic Academic Council. We may be witnessing the return of the ancients themselves. Kevin stood alone among the display cases, watching the alien scholars rush off to spread news of his miraculous interpretive abilities throughout the academic community. In the space of a single afternoon, he'd gone from routine bureaucrat to cosmic prophet, and he was beginning to suspect that his problems were just getting started. The walkie-talkie sat in its case, its NASA label clearly visible under the dramatic lighting. Kevin had a terrible feeling that by tomorrow, that simple identification would be the subject of doctoral dissertations across the galaxy. I should have called in sick, he muttered to himself, though he suspected that even the universe's most comprehensive medical leave policy wouldn't have covered accidentally becoming the galaxy's foremost expert on divine wisdom. The emergency session of the Galactic Academic Council convened in what could only be described as barely controlled chaos. Representatives from every major university, research institution, and archaeological society across the known galaxy had arrived at the Museum of Eternal Mysteries within hours of receiving news that a human had successfully decoded the sacred language. The main conference hall buzzed with the kind of nervous energy typically associated with scientific revolutions, religious reformations, and the moments just before civilizations realize they've made terrible mistakes. Kevin sat at what the aliens insisted on calling the chair of honored interpretation, which was really just a slightly fancier version of the uncomfortable conference room seats he'd grown to despise during his years of bureaucratic service. Around him, beings from dozens of different worlds whispered in their native languages, activated recording devices, and occasionally stared at him with the kind of reverent awe usually reserved for prophets and lottery winners. Chancellor Vorthek of the Universal Institute of Ancient Studies called the session to order with a ceremonial gong that probably cost more than Kevin's annual salary. The Chancellor's species resembled a cross between a sea anemone and a distinguished professor, complete with flowing robes that seemed to undulate independently of any detectable breeze. Esteemed colleagues, Chancellor Vorthek announced, his voice carrying the weight of academic authority and barely suppressed excitement. We gather today to witness what may be the most significant breakthrough in the history of galactic archaeology. The human Kevin Walsh has demonstrated an unprecedented ability to interpret the sacred inscriptions that have mystified our greatest minds for centuries. Kevin shifted uncomfortably in his chair as hundreds of alien eyes, eye stalks, and various other sensory organs focused on him. He'd spent the morning trying to convince anyone who would listen that there had been a fundamental misunderstanding, but his protests had only seemed to reinforce the alien's belief that he was displaying the characteristic humility expected of a true sage. Dr. Melkarian of the Celestial University of Cosmic Mysteries stood to address the assembly. Her species had evolved from something that looked like a philosophical octopus, and she gestured with her tentacles in patterns that Kevin suspected were supposed to be meaningful. Before we proceed, we must establish the credentials of our honored interpreter, Human Walsh. Perhaps you could demonstrate your abilities by decoding one of our most challenging inscriptions. A holographic display materialized above the conference table, showing a close-up image of text that Kevin immediately recognized as a standard warning label. The assembled academics leaned forward with the kind of anticipation usually reserved for miracle cures and free vacation packages. Warning, Kevin read without enthusiasm. High voltage, do not open, authorized personnel only, contact Earth Energy Commission for service requirements. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Beings throughout the hall began making what Kevin assumed were expressions of amazement, though with alien physiology, it was sometimes difficult to tell the difference between awe and severe digestive distress. Chancellor Vorthek's robes undulated with increased vigor, while several researchers activated emergency documentation protocols. Remarkable, Dr. Melkarian exclaimed, her tentacles writhing with excitement. The human reveals that this sacred prohibition contains warnings about high voltage, clearly a reference to the elevated spiritual energy contained within the ancient technology. And note the reference to authorized personnel. This proves that the predecessor civilization had established hierarchies of cosmic enlightenment. Kevin rubbed his temples and wondered if there was a polite way to suggest that perhaps the entire galactic academic community had been overthinking things for the past several centuries. It's just a safety warning on electrical equipment. The high voltage means it could electrocute you if you're not careful. Professor Quindala of the Institute for Metaphysical Archaeology nearly fell off his floating meditation cushion. The human casually mentions that the ancient devices possess the power to transcend physical existence. This electrocution must refer to some form of spiritual transformation that elevates consciousness beyond the mortal realm. No, it means it could kill you, Kevin said flatly, because sometimes directness was the only weapon against enthusiastic misinterpretation. The hall erupted into excited chatter as researchers compared notes and developed theories about ancient death rituals and sacred consciousness transfer protocols. Kevin watched with growing despair as his simple explanation was transformed into elaborate doctrines about cosmic transcendence and ritual sacrifice. Chancellor Vorthek restored order with another gong strike. Human Walsh, perhaps you could demonstrate your remarkable abilities by actually operating one of the sacred technologies. We understand you possess the knowledge required to perform the ritual of technological resurrection. Kevin looked around the hall at the expectant faces and realized that he'd reached the point where demonstration might be more effective than explanation. Fine. Could someone bring me the flashlight? I mean, the divine illumination orb, and maybe some standard batteries? The request sent the academic community into what appeared to be a state of near-religious ecstasy. The fact that Kevin had casually mentioned the sacred materials required for the ancient ritual was interpreted as further proof of his cosmic authority. Within minutes, the divine illumination orb was ceremonially transported to the conference table, accompanied by a collection of batteries that had been procured with the kind of urgent efficiency usually reserved for medical emergencies. Kevin picked up the flashlight, unscrewed the battery compartment, and began replacing the dead batteries with new ones. The simple, mechanical process was conducted in complete silence, as if he were performing surgery on the universe itself. Every movement was recorded by multiple devices, and Kevin had the uncomfortable feeling that his battery replacement technique was going to be analyzed by scholars for generations to come. When he clicked the flashlight on, the resulting beam of ordinary white light produced gasps of awe that echoed throughout the conference hall. Several beings made what appeared to be religious gestures, while others began taking detailed measurements of the illumination patterns. Behold, Chancellor Vorthek announced with the kind of dramatic flourish that suggested he'd been practicing this moment in front of a mirror. The human has successfully awakened the divine light. The ancient technology responds to his touch. Kevin turned the flashlight off and on a few times, mostly because he was beginning to understand that the aliens interpreted everything he did as profoundly significant. Each click of the switch produced